America needs to wake up to Ilhan Omar. She's changing right before your eyes. And there are three simple steps to the Islamification of politics. We've already lived it here in the UK. Number one, you have a voting block of people that are densely packed together, the same communities, Somali communities, Bangladeshi communities, four families living where one family used to live. And now you have them voting according to their religion, facilitated by the mosque. Funding can flow in. You have the Muslim Housing Association. We have a Muslim Police Association. We have events, especially for the Muslim community of London. We have an Eid celebration in the middle of London in Trafalgar Square, paid for by the Muslim Mayor of London to keep his voting bloc happy. And once you have people voting according to their religion, funded by funding streams coming in from God knows where, you'll see the changes start to happen. You're seeing them now. For us, it means that we no longer have bikinis on our underground because it would be offensive to some of the locals. It means that certain individuals can no longer come to our country because we don't want to upset local communities. And it means that Asia Bibi, for example, a Christian woman, was not given a place to stay here in the UK because we don't want to upset local communities. Once you have Islam in political power, your culture starts to change rapidly. You started this by allowing head coverings to be worn inside your positions of power. You've seen Ilhan Omar change from having this kind of modern looking, exotic looking, bright orange, how very fabulous, into now this darker, blacker head covering. Now we're coming out and speaking out against Israel. Now we're saying that the president should be impeached. Now we're standing by the socialist Maduro in Venezuela. America needs to wake up to Ilhan Omar.
And Katie Hopkins is living in the UK, which has been Islamized for a number of decades now. In fact, they now have over 80 Sharia courts. If you're unaware of what's been happening in Europe, check out The Islamization of the United Kingdom, a show that I did with Tommy Robinson. Now, in that video clip, Katie said that America needs to wake up to Ilhan Omar, and people are just now learning about a closed-door meeting that she had with visiting Turkish President Erdogan, which took place in New York in September of 2017, when Omar was still a Minnesota state representative. What's interesting, aside from the fact that the president of Turkey agreed to meet with a local Minnesota state legislator, is that it took place in the very same hotel room where Erdogan also met with the assembled top leadership of the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood. Speaking of which, we also know that Ilhan Omar violated a federal statute fundraising for Muslim Brotherhood charities. No surprise, though, because Omar publicly stated on Twitter that it's all about the Benjamins, baby, which must be the same reason why Rashida Tlaib received over $200,000 from George Soros' organization throughout 2016 and 2017. Now, you may not know that Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar both took their ceremonial swearing in on the Quran. But that's okay, because it's the people carrying guns who you need to be concerned about. Well, at least according to the mainstream media and the Islamists who hope you stay ill-informed. Which is the very reason why you need to know that the Muslim Brotherhood is the most successful Islamist organization in the world. In order to better understand an Islamist, we need to have a better understanding of Islam. So let's look back to the 7th century AD to a different part of the world, specifically what we now know as Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia, because that is where the founder of Islam was born and raised. According to tradition, Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born in AD 570 in the town of Mecca. Mecca was a polytheistic society, and that time period is referred to as the Age of Ignorance, also known as Jahiliyyah. In 595, when he was 25 years old, Muhammad married a wealthy 40-year-old widow named Khadijah. 15 years later, in 610, when he was 40 years old, while praying and meditating in a cave near Mecca, Muhammad had what is believed to have been a visitation from the angel Gabriel. he gave Muhammad the first of many revelations that he would receive over the next 22 years of his life. All of those revelations combined in the form of a book is what we now know as the Quran, which contains 114 chapters. However, it is believed that Muhammad received a little bit at a time on an as-needed basis. That particular night in the cave, Muhammad received what is now known as chapter 96 of the Quran. 2 years later, in 612, Muhammad began to preach a message of monotheism, that there was only one God, and that people should submit to him because the day of judgment was coming. So Muhammad peacefully invited people to Islam. Over the next 10 years of preaching and inviting, Muhammad had very few followers, and in the latter time period, both Muhammad's wife and uncle had died, and therefore he lost his money and his protection. By 622, Muhammad had angered the local leaders, and when he heard that there was an assassination plot on his life, Muhammad fled from Mecca to Yathrib, now known as Medina. This migration was a very important event in Islamic history, which marked the beginning of the Islamic calendar. Now, when Muhammad fled to Medina, he was initially welcomed by the Jews in that area, but as time went on, he continued to receive more revelations and more followers. And the revelations began to get longer, more detailed, and more aggressive. Unfortunately for Muhammad, the more details he shared with them, the more the Jews began to realize that the God he was talking about was sounding less and less like the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Eventually, the Jews rejected Muhammad, and that is when Muhammad rejected the Jews. Some of his earlier revelations and commands to his followers were abrogated or replaced by new revelations and new commands. Muhammad arrived in Medina as a refugee, but when he left Medina, he was a religious leader, a military leader, and a political leader, because he established and led the first Islamic state. In a 7-year period between 623 and 630, Muhammad was personally involved in 27 battles or military campaigns, and he sent his followers out on roughly double that. And it was in 630 that Muhammad and his followers went back to Mecca and conquered it. In chapter 9 of the Quran, we can read part of Muhammad's final marching orders to his followers. Fight against those who believe not in Allah nor in the last day, nor forbid that which has only been forbidden by Allah and his messenger, and those who acknowledge not the religion of truth among the people of the scripture, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Then, in 632, Muhammad died. When he was alive, Muhammad never told his followers who he wanted his successor to be. The events that followed turned into a major dispute which caused the Sunni-Shia split. However, each successor followed Muhammad's final marching orders, and here you can see the spread of Islam from 622 through 750. The dark orange shows the territory of the Islamic world from 622 to 632 under Muhammad himself. The light orange shows the territory added between 632 and 661 by the first 4 caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. The green areas show the territory added by the Umayyad caliphs from 661 to 750. The purple areas are the non-Islamic kingdoms, and the brown lines with arrows signify the directions of Islamic military campaigns. To find the most authoritative information about Muhammad and the origin of Islam, we need to look to some primary and secondary sources. According to Orthodox Islamic theology, the Quran is the eternal word of Allah. We also have the Hadith. These are the things that Muhammad said and did. We also have the Sirah literature. These are the biographies of Muhammad, and the 4 that you see here are the 4 oldest. Now, if you take the Hadith and combine that with the Sirah, that is how you get the Sunnah, the example of Muhammad himself. And if you combine the Quran and the Sunnah, this is how we get Sharia, Islamic law. There are 4 major schools of Islamic jurisprudence for Sunni Muslims, which is the majority of Muslims in the world, and those schools are the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali schools of Islamic law. To learn more about Islamic law, check out my presentation, Unveiling the Facts of Sharia. This is called Central California Edition, because when I was first asked to speak on the topic, it was for a group in Central California. So this presentation was catered to their area in particular. However, if you watch it, you can see how it parallels with the area of the world that you live in as well, regardless of where you live in the West. Now, the early jurists who created the schools of law also divided the world into two major houses or abodes. These two major divisions of the world are known as Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. Early jurists devised these terms to denote legal rulings for ongoing Muslim conquests after the time of Muhammad. In other words, the abode of Islam are areas of the world that are under Sharia, and the abode of war are areas of the world that are not under Sharia. Michael Nazir Ali said, "It has been traditionally interpreted as the duty of all Muslims to wage war until all infidels have been subdued and Islam is victorious. Jihad in these terms is unfinished until the latter has been transformed into the former." Not surprisingly, Islam continued to spread, and the caliphate that Muhammad established in the 600s continued throughout the centuries all the way into the time of the Ottoman Empire, which rose around the year 1300. It was also around that time that a medieval Hanbali scholar named Taqi al-Din Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah was reminding people that only the first 3 generations of Muslims perfectly followed the correct path of Islam. He defined a true Muslim as one who reads the Quran and follows the Sunnah, the lifestyle example of Muhammad. He said, any act of war against Dar al-Harb is morally justified, legal, and exempt from any ethical judgment. He also taught that fighting against non-Muslims is not the aim of the Islamic State, but fighting can be employed against those who deny Muslims the right to carry out their mission. What is that mission? The propagation of Islam. Around 400 years later, Ibn Taymiyyah had a huge fan by the name of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. He was an 18th century Sunni theologian who had memorized the Quran by the time he was 10 years old. He studied the work of Ibn Taymiyyah and became obsessed with Muslims returning to the puritanical norms that were practiced by Muhammad himself. Therefore, he held a severe and strict interpretation of the faith. Like Ibn Taymiyyah, al-Wahhab believed that the Quran and the Sunnah were the only 2 guides for personal conduct and governing law. He also worked with Muhammad ibn al-Saud to help create what we now know as Saudi Arabia. Both of these men were alive in the 1700s, which was around the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's decline, and it continued on a steady decline all the way into the 20th century. Whereas the colors in the previous map I showed you displayed the areas Islam spread to, the colors in this map show which areas were lost by the Ottoman Empire. And you can see that in 1923, the empire was down to just a fraction of what it once was. Then, in 1924, the caliphate was abolished. Under Western colonial rule, Islamic law was gradually phased out in some Islamic countries with only certain aspects of Sharia staying in place, and usually it had to do with family law. Some scholars say that Muslims can freely live in the West and obey Western laws if the West grants them entrance, guarantees them safety, and grants them the free practice of Islam. However, most traditional, fundamental, and devout Muslims say that these principles are not permanent and are simply temporary tools to justify living in non-Muslim societies during times of weakness and subjugation, when Muslims are the minority. This was the exact mindset that was held by Hassan al-Banna, a young 22-year-old teacher who, in 1928, established a group called the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, more commonly known as the Muslim Brotherhood. In 1938, at their 10th anniversary commemoration meeting, al-Banna said, "It is our conviction that the rulings and precepts of Islam are comprehensive and organize the affairs of this life and the next. Whoever believes that those precepts are only concerned with worship and spirituality is mistaken. Islam is creed and worship, country and nationality, religion and government, action and spirituality, book and sword." Their motto became, "Allah is our goal, the Prophet is our leader, the Quran is our law, jihad is our way, dying in the way of Allah is our highest aspiration." Al-Banna's ambition was to create a global Islamic superstate instituting Sharia as a universal law. He said, "It is a duty incumbent on every Muslim to struggle towards the aim of making every people Muslim, and the whole world Islamic, so that the banner of Islam can flutter over the earth and the call of the muezzin can resound in all corners of the world. God is greater." Interestingly, Al-Banna was also an admirer and supporter of Adolf Hitler, and in the 1930s he had Mein Kampf translated into Arabic. Still today, we see that some Muslims hate Jews just as much as Hitler did. This is not surprising, however, because Al-Banna had ties to Haj Amin al-Husseini. He was not only a disciple of Hassan al-Banna, but he was also the Mufti of Jerusalem and a Muslim Nazi. He spent World War II in Berlin recruiting Muslims for Hitler's legions and laying plans to open gas chambers in the Middle East. Husseini was also the uncle of Yasser Arafat. Now, by this time, the Muslim Brotherhood claimed to have hundreds of thousands of members, a strong political following, and therefore quite a few enemies as well. That is when the Muslim Brotherhood's special apparatus began to assassinate opposing political figures. While this was happening, many people were keeping a close eye on the work of the Muslim Brotherhood. One of them was a man named Sayyid Qutb. Like Al-Banna, Qutb was also born in Egypt in 1906, and like Abdul Wahhab, Qutb had also memorized the Quran by the time he was 10 years old. In 1933, Qutb not only graduated from college and became a teacher through the Egyptian Ministry of Education, but he also began his literary career. However, after embracing Islam, the themes of his writings began to change. Not only did he begin to follow the work of the Muslim Brotherhood, but he also began to start writing political articles which were in opposition to the Egyptian monarchy. This brought conflict between himself and the Ministry of Education. Then, in 1948, the Ministry of Education was hoping to get Qutb more focused on his teaching career than his political work. So they sent him to America to work on a master's degree in education at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley. However, he was scandalized by what he saw in the separation of church and state and in American churches. While he was in Colorado, one evening he attended a United Methodist dance and thought it was completely immoral. He went on to publish a short essay called "The America That I Have Seen." And in it, he was critical of things he'd observed in the United States: its materialism, individual freedoms, economic system, racism, brutal boxing matches, poor haircuts, superficiality in conversations and friendships, restrictions on divorce, enthusiasm for sports, lack of artistic feeling, animal-like mixing of the sexes, which went on even in churches, quote-unquote, and strong support for the new Israeli state. This reinforced Qutb's support for the necessity of Sharia, and his support of Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood. Hassan al-Banna said, "It is the nature of Islam to dominate, not to be dominated, to impose its laws on all nations and extend its power to the entire planet." But then, on February 12, 1949, al-Banna was assassinated by the Egyptian government. After Qutb heard about it, he completed his master's degree, and then he returned to Egypt in 1951. When he got there, he immediately became highly involved with the Muslim Brotherhood and became the editor-in-chief of their official journal. About a year later, on July 23, 1952, the Egyptian monarchy was overthrown in a coup d'etat by a group that turned out to be driven by Gamal Abdel Nasser. At first, Nasser's group seemed to cooperate with the Muslim Brotherhood for political purposes. However, the Muslim Brotherhood wanted the country to start enacting laws in accordance with Sharia, and they soon realized that the Revolutionary Council was not going along with their plan. Then, in 1954, the journal that Qutb was in charge of was banned, and Qutb, as well as other Muslim brothers, were arrested and put in jail. However, they weren't in jail very long before they were released. Then, 9 months later, in October of 1954, there was a failed assassination plot on the life of Nasser. Although there were mixed opinions on whether it was real or staged, Nasser used the incident to try and destroy the Muslim Brotherhood once and for all. Over 1,000 Muslim brothers were arrested, and several leaders were sentenced to death. Qutb was tortured by his jailers, and after words, he was so weak that he couldn't even be in the courtroom the day he was sentenced to 15 years in prison, which was in July of 1955. Out of all the books Qutb wrote in his life, his most popular works were written from his prison cell. It was in prison where he wrote his 18-volume commentary on the Quran titled In the Shade of the Quran. In 1964, due to poor health and a little political help from the president of Iraq, Qutb was granted an early release from prison. However, shortly before he was released, his book Milestones had been published. The popularity of the book and its contents resulted in Qutb being rearrested in 1965, and he was sentenced with the death penalty. Then, on August 29, 1966, Qutb was hung in Cairo, Egypt. This caused Muslims to recognize him as a martyr for the faith, and through his writings he had become the theologian of the Muslim Brotherhood. Today, Milestones is still one of the most popular books amongst Islamic fundamentalists. So what does Milestones contain? Simply the same viewpoints held by other reformers in the past. Like Abdul Wahhab and Ibn Taymiyyah, Qutb wanted to get back to the Quran and the Sunnah, the example of Muhammad. He also said that the world is steeped in Jahiliyyah, just like it was in pre-Islamic Mecca. Qutb also emphasizes the same pattern that we find when we study the life of Muhammad. Just as Muhammad in Mecca preached a simple message of monotheism, Qutb said Muslims should focus on building community and inviting people to Islam, calling them out of the polytheistic Jahili system. No need to give theology lessons, just call people to Islam. But it doesn't end there. Qutb endorses and describes the same pattern that we find in Muhammad's life. Qutb writes, "Thus, for 13 years after the beginning of his messengership, he called people to God through preaching, without fighting or jizya, and was commanded to restrain himself and to practice patience and forbearance. Then he was commanded to migrate, and later permission was given to fight. Then he was commanded to fight those who fought him, and to restrain himself from those who did not make war with him. Later he was commanded to fight the polytheists until God's religion was fully established. After the command for jihad came, the non-believers were divided into 3 categories. 1, those with whom there was peace. 2, the people whom the Muslims were at war. And 3, the dhimmis." One of Qutb's disciples was Ayman al-Zawahiri. By the age of 14, al-Zawahiri had joined the Muslim Brotherhood. After the Egyptian government executed Sayyid Qutb, al-Zawahiri's mission in life was to put Sayyid Qutb's vision into action. He helped form a group that was devoted to overthrowing the Egyptian government and replacing it with an Islamic state. His cell eventually merged with others to form al-Jihad, or Egyptian Islamic Jihad. This is the same group who was enraged by the actions of Muhammad Anwar al-Sadat, who became president after Nasser died in 1970. Some people love Sadat because he embraced religion. However, the Islamists hated the fact that Sadat worked towards establishing a strong relationship with the West, and he supported peaceful negotiations with Israel. This was the reason why, on October 6, 1981, Sadat was assassinated during a military parade, a parade that was celebrating the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. Sadat's successor was Hosni Mubarak, and Mubarak's successor was Mohammad Morsi el-Ayat, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. He was president during the infamous Arab Spring. Morsi was eventually overthrown and was succeeded by the current president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah Sayyid Hussein Halil el-Sisi. It's interesting to know that, while the Muslim Brotherhood is a worldwide organization and ideologically work together, they have different methods of operation in response to local conditions, quote-unquote, and therefore work independently from other groups. For example, in Jordan, the Muslim Brotherhood openly participates in elections. In Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood is completely underground, and being a known member of it is punishable by death. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood falls somewhere in between. It's not technically legal, but they're usually allowed to function most of the time. It's also very important to know that All of the jihadist groups, including ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Boko Haram, have the same Islamic worldview as the Muslim Brotherhood. They all want the world to be under Sharia, Islamic law. However, whereas ISIS has a short-term goal of wanting a global caliphate yesterday and is focused on physical fighting and striking terror into the hearts of unbelievers, which is what the Quran commands them to do in chapter 8, verse 12, the Muslim Brotherhood has a long-term goal of establishing a caliphate at a later date, and they're willing to participate in a democratic system in order to use it to their advantage and destroy a country from within. The Muslim Brotherhood is patient and completely okay with a slow, long-term, methodical, and incremental plan. Due to the major contrast between their methods of operation, ISIS is considered a group of jihadists, while the Muslim Brotherhood is usually considered peaceful. However, they have a lot more in common than most people realize. Both Islamists and jihadists hate Israel and the West. They also both want the world under Sharia. However, Islamist groups don't focus primarily on armed struggle, while the jihadists obviously do. The Islamists are very patient, while the jihadists are very impatient. It has been shown time and time again that when an Islamist becomes impatient, he will commonly become a jihadist. Case in point, Swedish Islamophobia expert turned ISIS fighter arrested in Syria. Also, the jihadists who don't end up on the nightly news, or the ones who do, are commonly a distraction from what the Islamists are doing behind the scenes, especially here in the United States. One of the reasons why we know this is because of a document that was found by the FBI in the early 2000s during a search warrant in the home of a man named Ismail al-Barasi, who had funded Hamas. This was just one of the many documents that filled 80 banker boxes that were hidden in his sub-basement. These were the archives of the Muslim Brotherhood in America. The author of the document, Muhammad Akram, was a member of the board of directors for the Muslim Brotherhood in North America and a senior leader of Hamas. The memorandum lists many organizations that were founded by the Muslim Brotherhood. The first one on the list is the Islamic Society of North America. Its main focus is to foster interfaith dialogues with major Christian denominations and Jewish organizations. To learn about the deception behind these dialogues, watch a show we did called The Deception of Interfaith Dialogues. The second organization on the list is the Muslim Students Association. They focused on influencing K through 12 and university education in both the United States and Canada. So this would not only include your child or grandchild's field trip to a mosque or Islamic center, it would also include the Islamist infiltration of American universities. That is not only the focus of this article, which came out in March of 2018, but is actually something that has been happening for a long time. Another thing that would fall into this category is the $20 million that Al-Walid bin Talal gave to Harvard to create a Sharia studies program, the $20 million he gave to Georgetown University for a Muslim Christian understanding program, and the $10 million that Saleh Abdullah Kamel gave Yale to establish an Islamic law center. But I need to spotlight a third organization on the list, number 22, which is the Islamic Association for Palestine.
The Holy Land Foundation trial was adjudicated in Dallas, Texas in 2008 and identified CAIR as a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, or the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood's Palestine Committee, which is Hamas.
Hamas, currently the only Muslim Brotherhood group in the world that also forms a government and rules over a large number of people in Gaza. And yet CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, who is hard at work here in America, have offices throughout the United States. CAIR's focus is government and military. And interestingly, even though CAIR was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation terrorism trial, it has provided training to the FBI, CIA, Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and others. Why do we have so much information about CAIR? The U.S. is indebted to Chris Gobbets, who went undercover and obtained over 12,000 documents and about 300 hours of audio and video recordings. In the 2009 book, Muslim Mafia, Inside the Secret Underworld That's Conspiring to Islamize America, you can read about Chris's 6-month undercover investigation of the Washington-based CAIR as he posed as a Muslim convert. The book presents documents that Chris obtained as an intern at CAIR and support the book's assertion. CAIR is a Muslim Brotherhood front group. Here Chris is shaking hands with the same man who was standing near Linda Sarsour in this recent picture. And he is the same man who was standing behind former President George W. Bush 6 days after 9/11 in 2001, when he declared on live television, "Islam is peace." So who is this man? His name is Nihad Awad. He is the former public relations director for the Islamic Association for Palestine, and he is now the founder and CEO of CAIR. According to Chris Gobbets, CAIR has a training program in which they teach Muslims how to respond to anything negative that is said about Islam by spinning the narrative and inserting the term Islamophobia into the conversation. Islamophobia. Perhaps the most ironic part is that CAIR claims to be a human rights organization, and yet they condemn a phobia, which is a thought that exists in a person's mind. So the right to freedom of thought is actually something that CAIR condemns if they don't like what you're thinking. Therefore, this self-proclaimed human rights organization doesn't seem to understand its own hypocrisy, because to condemn a phobia is to condemn the freedom of thought, and to condemn the freedom of thought is to condemn what is actually Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it was 5 years ago when CAIR was named a terrorist organization by the United Arab Emirates, and yet it was just joining Egypt and Saudi Arabia and banning the Muslim Brotherhood and its affiliates. In spite of all this, with many people already thinking about what will happen in 2020, when the Democratic debate started a while back, there were 16 likely Democratic presidential candidates who endorsed CAIR. On top of that, there's also a list of 100 congressional lawmakers who support CAIR and have written letters of support. 28 of those 100 are in California alone. What's not surprising is that many of CAIR's tactics fall right in line with those taught in this book, The Methodology of Dawa, which was published in 1989. It contains part of the strategy on how to make the message of Islam acceptable to the West. Part of the strategy includes social justice, rendering useful services, and building relationships with the community through service to humanity outreach activities and programs in order to gain recognition and favor from the community and political leaders. Yes, they will build relationships with people from all political parties, government officials, military leaders, members of law enforcement, and religious leaders, and they will take advantage of any opportunity that is given to them. They will visit schools, ask schools to visit them, and also connect with the media as often as possible, especially when there's anything in the news about Islam. They also make an effort to participate in interfaith dialogues or panel discussions where all of the non-Muslim panelists are uneducated about Islamic history, theology, and the nature of Islamic expansion. With all these tactics in place, they believe the Islamization of the West is possible through Dawa alone. Think of Dawa as cultural jihad or civilization jihad, where swords are not necessary. And as this Islamic newspaper says, don't forget that Dawa works on the same principles as that of advertisement. Bulk and repeated exposure creates acceptance. So how are the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islamist groups attempting to influence the way you think about Islam? Well, at the last Women's March, there were a bunch of women who just couldn't wait to put on a hijab to somehow bond with Linda Sarsour and Muslim women here in the West. Apparently, very few people study what life is like for many women in other countries who are actually punished for not wearing one. Case in point, 8 women arrested in Iran for posting photos to social media without hijabs. Another recent example is Iranian human rights activist Nasrin Sotoudeh, who has been sentenced to 38 years in prison and 148 lashes. What could she have done to deserve that? Hold on to your chair. She is renowned for representing human rights defenders, dissidents, and women who protested against the compulsory wearing of a headscarf in the country. To learn about this false claim that the hijab ennobles women, or that one should be worn in order to show solidarity, quote unquote, be sure to watch a show we did called Khadija, Muhammad's pre-Islamic wife.
So to me, I say raise hell, make people uncomfortable. Because here's the truth. Here's the truth. Far too long, we have lived with the discomfort of being a second-class citizen. And frankly, I'm tired of it, and every single Muslim in this country should be tired of it. CAIR was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties.
No surprise that one of Linda Sarsour's Democratic allies are making these types of claims. After that video, one of Sarsour's allies came to Omar's defense using another Islamist tactic.
On these remarks themselves, some people did something as a reference to 9/11. Do you think she should have rethought her words? Do you worry about the appropriateness of that?
They do this all the time to us, especially women of color. They do that. They take our words out of context because they're afraid, because we speak truth. We speak truth to power.
Be advised, women of color is the newest victim card carrying term to use if you want to draw people's attention away from this new race called Islam and the small minority group called Muslims, which is about 1.6 billion people in the world. So let's hear how another one of Linda's allies responded.
Some Democrats supporting Omar.
We are getting to the level where this is an incitement of violence against progressive women of color.
Once again, women of color. This lines right up with the Islamist tactic of reaching out to many different minority groups in order to gain power. Case in point, the ever-popular Blackness and Islam type events, where the Islamists try to influence the black community. These four people, as well as every other person in the world, need to watch the show called The Hidden Islamic Slave Trade and Colorism. Then you will learn about the slave trade that trafficked even more people and in much worse conditions than the transatlantic slave trade that you learn about in public schools. And the Islamic slave trade is still in effect today. Unfortunately, many people do not have any idea that Muhammad was racist towards black, that he bought, owned, and sold black slaves as well. Another thing the Islamists are doing is pushing for more and more refugees. For some vital information about this situation, buy a book called Stealth Invasion, Muslim Conquest Through Immigration and Resettlement Jihad. And in this book, you'll read a whole lot of information that people need to get. And on my Vimeo channel, you can watch 3 shows that I did with the author of the book called the man's name is Leo Homan, and the show is called Colliding Worldviews. He's been on 3 times now. Another group the Islamists reach out to, at least for right now, is the LGBTQ community. But by simply looking into Islamic law, you'll notice that the actual punishment ranges from 85 lashes to being stoned to death, depending on where you live and what school of Islamic jurisprudence is followed. If all this weren't enough, the Muslim Brotherhood is also using sugar-coated, out-of-context Quranic verses to appeal to people throughout the U.S. This particular example is on a billboard for all to see. "Hey ISIS, you suck," from actual Muslims. Then it says in the top right, "Life is sacred," Quran 5:32. Now this billboard uses just 3 words to sum up an entire verse. This is the same verse that is taken out of context when you hear someone say, killing one person is like killing the whole world, and saving one life is like saving all of humanity. So let's look at what the entire verse actually says. We decreed for the children of Israel, yes, this is referring to the Jews, that whoever kills a soul, not in retaliation for a soul, or corruption in the land, is like one who has killed the whole of mankind, and whoever saves a life is like one who saves all of mankind. So number 1, this verse is referring to a decree for the Jews. And 2, it's interesting how no one ever seems to read the next verse, which was actually the prescriptive command to Muhammad's followers. So what does verse 33 say? Indeed, the punishment of those who fight Allah and His Messenger and go around corrupting the land is to be killed, crucified, have their hands and feet cut off on opposite sides, or to be banished from the land. Now you know why verse 32 is summed up into just 3 words, and why verse 33 is never illustrated on billboards, or let alone even mentioned to anyone at all. Last but not least, we need to spotlight anti-Semitism. A resolution against it could have been passed until Linda Sarsour helped scrap and weaken it to a generalized anti-hate. As another one of Linda's allies, it's no surprise that Omar is quite proud of Linda, and rest assured, or maybe not, that Muhammad said, "The last hour will not be established until you fight with the Jews, and the stone behind which a Jew will be hiding will say, 'O Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, so kill him.'" So Muhammad was the founder of Islamic Jew hatred. And you should be aware of an old Arab proverb which says, "After Saturday comes Sunday." That is the Islamic promise that after they have dealt with the Jews, they will come for the Christians next. But we aren't entirely there yet. Right now, the Muslim Brotherhood works to get people who are affiliated with it into positions of power and influence in order to infiltrate the highest levels of government so that the Muslim Brothers are part of the decision-making process. In addition to that, they befriend and build relationships with people who are currently in positions of power and influence. The Muslim Brotherhood does this in order to build trust and ultimately influence and manipulate those people who are in positions of power, and also to gather intelligence that will keep the Muslim Brotherhood informed about what is happening behind closed doors. The Muslim Brotherhood follows the old adage, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Not surprisingly, a common description of a Muslim Brotherhood operative is the nicest guy in the room. A nice guy who actually wants to take away your rights. So here's the bottom line. The Muslim Brotherhood is a worldwide organization and the largest Islamist movement in the modern era, whose vision of a liberated society is one ruled by Islamic law, Sharia, institutionalizing the oppression of women, gays, Jews, Christians, and all non-Muslims, beginning with the denial of freedom of thought and freedom of speech. It was established 91 years ago, and they've accomplished a whole lot since then. So in America, will there be a day of reckoning for the Muslim Brotherhood? Many people continue to ask President Trump to designate the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, as other countries already have. But he hasn't yet. But regardless of what happens at the top, what you need to remember is this. In the book of Romans in the New Testament, Paul tells us that there is no authority except from God, and that those that exist have been instituted by God. This should remind us that God is sovereign, so no matter what happens in the world, nothing is outside of God's infinite knowledge and power. This means that when things happen, whether we like them or not, either God caused them to happen or He allowed them to happen. When Obama was in office for 8 years, God caused it or He allowed it. If Trump is in office for 8 years, it's because God caused it or allowed it. In the Old Testament book of Daniel, which was written in the 6th century BC, he told us that God removes kings and sets up kings. And today we need to keep the same thing in mind when it comes to our presidents. Sometimes He gives good authorities as a blessing, and sometimes He institutes evil rulers as a means of trial or judgment. The most important thing to keep in mind is that God rules over all earthly authorities. Last but not least, what should all of us be doing? What is our part of the solution? First, since a number of people seem to forget where the free speech zones are, I always have a highly detailed map with me. Remember that one person's freedom of speech can result in another person being offended. Therefore, the First Amendment grants you the right to offend people and to be offended. In fact, offensive speech is the only kind of speech that needs to be protected and defended. Why? Because no one is offended, or no one ever complains about non-offensive speech when he says something that they like or agree with. Second, there are a number of people out there who hate Muslims just because they're Muslims. But people need to realize that Muslims are human beings who are made in the image of God, which means they have intrinsic value and intrinsic human rights. Unfortunately, several Muslims, and even people who have been perceived to be Muslims when they actually weren't, have been the victims of violent crimes due to other people's intolerance. And this is very unfortunate, heartbreaking, and unacceptable. In a different way, a friend of mine says all Muslims are victims because they're believing the lie of Islam. What we need to do is love Muslims, but be completely free to critique Islam. Why? We should love Muslims because they're people. And we should be free to critique Islam because Islam is a religio-political system, a religion and a political ideology combined. Third, you need to get informed and help inform others. That includes sharing this presentation with everyone you know. Also, making sure that people are aware of the Muslim Brotherhood and its many front groups right here in America, and aware of which people in all different fields have ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, or have been influenced by them. Fourth, continue to love your Muslim friends, neighbors, coworkers, and classmates, and know that a person who loves American freedom and practices their religion peacefully while in full, genuine support of the Constitution and Bill of Rights is not who you should be most concerned about. Muslims and the Constitution can be compatible. Sharia and the Constitution cannot. Fifth, remember that many Muslims in America and throughout the world live peaceful lives, and they would not support this agenda if they found out about it. Are there moderate Muslims in the world, using the Western sense of the term moderate? Yes, there are millions of them, but there is no moderate Islam. Why? Because your moderate or nominal Muslim friend, neighbor, coworker, or classmate who loves American freedom does not define Islam. Muhammad defined Islam 1400 years ago. The primary and secondary sources are more widely available today than ever before, and reading those sources is causing many Muslims to leave Islam when they find out what those sources actually say about Muhammad and the spread of Islam, especially between the 7th and 10th centuries AD. Sixth, do not support the Muslim Brotherhood or anyone who supports the Muslim Brotherhood. Many people who currently support their front groups do so out of ignorance. So many of them are not aware of the end goal of this agenda. From a political perspective, think of it this way. People commonly say hindsight is 20/20. So now, looking back, do you think a free society of people would have actually voted for Hitler if they knew, before they cast their vote, what his ultimate goals were and the end game of his ideology? No. And now you know the ultimate goals and end game of the Muslim Brotherhood. You now have the insight to guide your foresight. So don't vote for the Muslim Brotherhood or anyone who supports them. Seventh, remember that Islam is a religio-political system. However, the religion is the base of the system. So the politics don't influence the religion influences the politics. What all people need to realize is that since the foundation of the system is a religious one, at the end of the day, this is primarily a spiritual issue, not a political one. So any attempts of a political solution will not last in the long term. A spiritual problem requires a spiritual solution. So what do we have to offer? We have the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. In the New Testament, we read in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And then he appeared to Peter, then to his 12 disciples. Then he appeared to more than 500 people at one time. Historical and archaeological evidence are just two of the things that set Christianity apart from all the man-made religions out there, one of which is Islam. Unlike all the man-made religions, Christianity is a reasonable faith based on evidence. So the gospel needs to be shared with everyone, and everyone includes all Muslims. God commands all people everywhere to repent and put their trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. When we do that, God forgives our sins and grants us the gift of everlasting life. Now, in case you happen to be an atheist or an agnostic or skeptic, keep in mind what Richard Dawkins has now finally come to admit. I have mixed feelings about the decline of Christianity insofar as Christianity might be a bulwark against something worse. Since he's from the UK, he's probably realized how the growth of Islam, especially over the last few decades, has changed the UK's societies and political environment. We as Americans need to look to the UK and much of Europe and realize that we can either learn from their mistakes or follow in their footsteps. Hopefully you have now realized the truthfulness of Ronald Reagan's statement when he said, "If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth." If you're an American who loves American freedom, this is an issue for you, because this topic has to do with national security, American freedom, and the documents which our country was founded upon. And the success or failure of this plan will determine the future of the America that your children and grandchildren will live in. Reagan also said, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on to our children to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free." God bless you, and God bless America. Please visit our website, radicaltruth.net. We can get a whole lot of information and articles and a whole lot of different resources that can help you get more educated about this topic and help other people get educated as well. We're also a 501c3 ministry, so we would appreciate if you support our vital work. You know how important it is to please support our work. You can do so by making a tax-deductible donation via debit or credit card, or you can even send in a check or money order. And if you click that donate button on the website, that'll let you know how you can do that. Also, be sure to like and follow our Facebook page, where you will get the news and commentary that you'll never get in the mainstream media. Let other people know about that as well. God bless you. Please share this information with others, and we will talk with you soon.